Today we're going to talk about if you should buy a Porsche 911 over a Boxster. How's it going? I hope you're doing well with all the craziness in the world. If you followed this channel for a while, you probably know that this is my fourth Porsche that I've owned. The Porsche that I owned before this one was a 986 generation Boxster. I owned that car for over 6 years with very little issues, and finally decided to sell it and move to the 911. This is the 996 generation 911. Happens to be that my Boxster was a 1999. This is also a 1999. Part of the reason I got this instead of, say, a Cayman was simply the price was too good to pass up. This particular one is the cheapest Porsche 911 Carrera Coupe with under 100,000 miles on it, and still has under 100,000 miles on it in the United States with a clean title. I've also driven newer 911s and Boxsters. In particular, I've driven a 981 Boxster S and a 991 Carrera S. So I'll only be using some of those other experiences in newer Porsches to talk about whether the 911 is worth the extra expense. So let's get right to it. Let's talk about whether the 911 is worth the extra money that you will pay over a Boxster. First, the thing that most people bring up, and the very first thing, is going to be just power. 911 in general, you're going to get a more powerful engine. When I moved from the 986 Boxster to a 996 911, that meant about 100 more horsepower. And that's a car that in manual form versus the manual of the Boxster, the 911 only weighs about 100 pounds more. So that's pretty good power to weight ratio, even with the Tiptronic versus the manual. My Boxster was a manual, this one's a Tiptronic, part of the reason it's cheap. The Tiptronic adds an additional 100 pounds, so you're about 200 pounds more in a 986 Boxster, and you're just over 3,000 pounds with the Tiptronic, which is not bad. But going with that extra power, you also get extra traction. The engine hanging over the rear axle pushes down a bit more when you take off, so it feels even faster than it is. Now, I had a regular Boxster because 99 they didn't make the Boxster S, so that was the next year, but a manual normal Boxster with 0 to 60 in 6.7 seconds according to Porsche. Some magazines have managed as fast as 6 seconds. Not sure how good the car was after that, but they managed it. The 996 generation 911, 0 to 60 is 5.2 seconds according to Porsche with a manual, 6 seconds with the Tiptronic. Of course, Porsche is very conservative on their times, just like with the Boxster. So with the manual, you can do it in 4.9 seconds. At least that's the time that magazines have been able to have. And with the Tiptronic, you're still talking about 5.6 seconds. That's if you use it in manual mode, but anyone can pretty much replicate it with the Tiptronic. So a Tiptronic 911 is about as quick as a Boxster S manual. When you get the chance, you gotta just go for it. Where the power argument kind of falls apart is when you start talking about 981 Spider or the 718 Spider and 718 GTS that they just announced. Those cars have very powerful engines, and there's really a good argument to be made that they're better value and better performing cars than a base 911 Carrera. Of course, the next thing to talk about, and this is where the Boxster has a bit of an advantage, is handling. Handling is very different between a 911 and a Boxster. 911, you're going to want to brake a little bit into it, make sure you point the car correctly, and then come out of the corner using your extra traction. With the Boxster, it's neutral the whole way. You can just keep more speed into the corner and all the way through the corner. Now with newer cars, like the 991 that I've driven, it's a little bit different. They handle pretty neutral as well because of things like torque vectoring and other gadgetry. Now in the 996, you didn't have all that In a lot of ways, it's the last 911 that has more of a vintage feel. So there aren't very many nanny things. It does have traction control, but that's it. Through the corners, people will be less nervous usually. In the Boxster, it just feels more natural. The feel of the mid-engine layout feels a little less daunting to someone. Even just the knowledge that the engine's out back, and you can kind of get scared a little bit about the idea of upsetting the balance. Even in the newest cars, even though it's a lot harder to do. Now, a big reason that someone would choose a Boxster over a 911 tends to be price, right? The Boxster is the cheaper car. Like in the 986, you could argue it's the cheaper car, but it got a lot of its big brother's hand-me-downs. About 40% of it is shared with the 996. But for a 986 generation Boxster versus a 996 generation Boxster, on average, like for like, you're talking about roughly an $8,000 difference. Sometimes the difference can be a little bit more. It depends on the specs and all that kind of stuff, what you're buying. And of course, the turbo is a whole different animal. With a newer 911 versus a base Boxster, so you're talking base Carrera versus base Boxster, it's about $40,000 difference. And that's a lot of money. You know, $40,000 is nothing to sneeze at. One of the big differences is in the newest cars, in the 718 Boxster versus a 911. The 911 still has a flat 6. In the base 718, you get a flat 4. Turbocharged, it's a pretty powerful little engine, but it's not twin turbocharged, so there is some turbo lag in there. It's not 80s turbo lag, but there's a bit of turbo lag. So you do get that for your money and some of the amenities and such that are standard. It has a few extra standard things. So another big thing is going to be livability. What are they like to live with? The Boxster has 2 trunks. It has a small one in the back. It's really small, but you can get some stuff there. And a big one in the front. The front trunk in the 911 and the Boxster is essentially the same. So there's a little bit more versatility in that area as far as trunk space. However, the 911 has back seats. They're pretty much useless in most cases, but for small children, my 2 boys are 12 and 9, and then I have a daughter that is 2. So the 12-year-old sits up front and the other 2 can sit in the back. And that makes it so all 3 of us can go in the same car, and I don't have to take my family car if my wife's not going, which is a minivan. And if you don't want to use the rear seats, you can fold them down and you do get a storage shelf. So that does kind of make up a bit for the 911 not having 2 trunks. Although you do have to put stuff through the car to put it there, so there's that. Engine access for people who want to work on things themselves is actually easier in the Boxster. So it takes more work to get to the engine because you have to put the top in service mode. You have to remove carpet to get to the top of the engine, where the 911, you just open the back of the 911 and boom, there's the engine there. However, the engine sits back further. So some things are very, very hard to get. Can't get to them from the front. So you would have to lower it, or you have to remove a bunch of stuff to get to it, such as belts and things of that nature. The Boxster has an access panel right behind the rear seats. The access panel gives you access to your accessory belt. So if you're a home mechanic and you want to kind of work on these yourselves, the Boxster actually, I think, is slightly easier to work on. They're both about the same, but just a slight edge to the Boxster. And of course, with the Boxster, you always get an open air driving experience. With the 911, I mean, I have a sunroof, so yeah, I guess I do get an open air driving experience if I want. But with the 911, if you don't get the cabriolet, you don't have that option for open air driving. There's also something to be said for a vehicle that was designed to have no top. Something that was designed that way in the beginning tends to be built for that purpose, so it handles or it drives better than maybe a car that wasn't originally designed to be a convertible, and then they chop the roof and they add structural bracing. However, with the 911, you can get it in coupe. I know technically you can get the Boxster in coupe, it's called a Cayman. But with the 911, you can get it in a coupe and you get a little more structural rigidity if you go that way. That's actually probably the reason why the coupes tend to cost a little bit more on the used market. Of course, when you buy it brand new, it's one of those mini options like Tiptronic option, lowers your resale value but added price to the initial sticker. Of course, with any Porsche, it comes down to the driving experience, because it might be worth extra money if the driving experience is better. But if the driving experience is about the same, especially on the road where you're probably going to be most of the time, then is it worth the extra money? So from a driving experience standpoint, the Boxster is just more confidence inspiring. That mid-engine layout, the neutral handling, you feel like you can really go for it in just about every situation. There is a limit though, and I've found that before. If it is wet out and you're coming onto a freeway on-ramp, don't try to give it a little extra gas, because you'll spin. The Boxster is a momentum car. Really, the 996 to a degree is a momentum car, but there's enough power there. It's not, by today's standards, not so much power, but there's enough power there that you can make up for a lot of things. But the Boxster, really, you have to take speed into a corner, you have to carry it through. The 911, you can have a lot less speed coming in because you have more acceleration. So depending on driving skill, if you go to like a driver's education event, a lot of times the guys in the Boxsters or the Boxster S's will be very close to the guys in the 911s, especially if the guy in the Boxster has more driving experience. They're faster. The quickest way to make your car faster is to learn how to drive better. It'll drive a lot of 911 guys crazy, because it's like, I spent more for this should be a lot better, but the issue's not the car, it's you. Now, with the Boxster, you can carry more speed into the corner and through the corner. With the 911, it's a little different. You have to set yourself up in the corner. As you're coming out of the corner, you're going to use the car's traction, and the one thing you don't want to do is lift, especially in the older ones. You'll upset the balance of the car, and your engine could end up in front of you because it's still behind you, but you could be going the wrong way. The difference is the 911 is more akin to a chainsaw. Does the job, it does it quickly. Now, it's a great car, don't get me wrong there. It's just the way it does some of its stuff is a little less refined. Even in the newest ones, there's just that hint that it's not quite as good as a mid-engine car. Where the Boxster and Cayman, they're more of scalpels, precision instruments for carving things up. In this case, corners. Chainsaw's a lot more powerful than a scalpel, but if the surgeon came in with that, you'd run the other way. So, is the 911 worth the extra money over a Boxster? My advice to anyone that's going back and forth between the two, especially when you look at the used market, a lot of times the prices aren't that much different to go from a Boxster to a 911. My advice is test drive them both. Some people really don't like the way 911s drive. It's different. It's just an experience. You have to drive one to know. The front end tends to be a little bit lighter, things of that nature. It's just a different experience. And they take a little bit more time to learn how far you can go without going too far. Especially when you look more like 996, 993, 964. You start looking back further. As you get into the 997, which still is closer to the 996, but 997, definitely 991. These cars have engineered out a lot of the scariness that was in some of the older ones. Even the 996 and 993, 964s had engineered a lot of scariness in the earlier ones, but they also had a lot more power. But test drive and see which one you like better. Some people will like the Boxster or a Cayman better than a 911 because of the mid-engine. For others, though, the extra power in the 911, and to a degree the fact that it's the top of the line, so potentially it's got more options, that will often sway some people to go the 911 route. The thing is, just because the 911 is the top of the line doesn't mean it's the car for you. Porsche makes a lot of great cars. The 911 is their greatest hit. But the Boxster, Cayman, and when you go back further, you got 928, 944. These cars are very good cars. If they weren't made by Porsche, any other company would probably have these as their best car. It's just that Porsche has the 911 as its best car. with very few exceptions. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about the cheapest Porsche 911 Carrera Coupe with a clean title and less than 100,000 miles in the United States, check out this video. Otherwise, check out this other video that YouTube thinks you should watch. Now get out there and drive.